Otto Warmbier of the University of Virginia thought that he's smarter than the people doing smuggling and political dissidents in DPRK for years. Let's explore. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Now, as I'm sure you all know by now, a 22-year-old American student has been sentenced to 15 years of hard labor in the North Korean Gulag for allegedly stealing a propaganda sign from a staff-only area in the Yanggakdo International Hotel in Pyongyang, where he was staying. Now, I'll leave links in the low bar with further details about the case if by some miracle you haven't heard of this story yet. Now, I don't want to discuss the case per se because this is one of those situations where the facts of the case don't exactly matter. He probably did bother the DPRK cultists somehow, whether by stealing the sign or simply trying to be a smartass. And the reason I believe this is because if the commies had wanted a hostage as a leverage in a future negotiation, they would have taken 2 or 3 rather than just 1, as they always do when they kidnap foreigners for various purposes. The fact that they didn't, even though Kim Jong-un appears to be much more of a bully than the late Kim Jong-il, suggests the idea of using Warmbier as a leverage came after he was arrested for whatever petty crime he had committed. Now, in order to get to the point, which is to list the realistic options of ending this situation in a quasi-civilized manner, I need to share with you several details that the overwhelming majority of the planet simply does not know about the DPRK. Okay, so buckle up because this can't be said in a short format. First off, the Kim Jong-un's regime is indeed shaking, and it's shaking in a way that it has never happened since the founding of the nation by the eternal president Kim Il-sung, or Kim I, as I like to call him. This young leader's grip on power is far thinner than it has ever been the case with the Pyongyang regime. He faces dissidents within the high echelons of the party, he faces more and more overt dissidents from the populace, and more importantly, the royal court economy doesn't work anymore as it used to, which only makes things worse. Now, what is the royal court economy? Well, it's essentially a parallel system run by the higher echelons of the Communist Party with which the Kim dynasty gets the much-needed hard currency to pay for the gifts. You know, this tradition started over 20 years ago when it became way too apparent, even for the isolated apparatchiks, that the Soviet-style system simply isn't sustainable. So Kim Jong-il, the father of the current leader, started using Macau accounts and Swiss accounts to get himself involved in various trades, such as the drug trade, the arms trade, the hookers trade, and so on. The profits were then invested into high-end gifts, such as luxury items, Western cars, whiskey, and things of that nature, that were then distributed to the most loyal party officials. Now, I know it sounds petty, but it worked. The Kim dynasty has been buying the loyalty of their top party officials in this manner for at least 20 years, probably even more than that, since 92, so 24 years by now. And the problem is that today the rest of the world isn't going through such a magnificent economic period as it was the case between 92 and 2008. And DPRK has gotten slightly better, actually, from an economic standpoint, since the hunger of the 1990s, or the arduous march, as the period is called within North Korea. This means that the expectations of the top party officials have actually increased. Whereas in 1995 they could have been bought with a collection shotgun or a bottle of whiskey, now a BMW is preferable, and that's quite expensive. To make things worse, Western agencies, both private and state agencies, have started to find the secret accounts through which the dynasty was doing the necessary money laundering to bring them back to Pyongyang. This aspect only made things worse for this system, which is known amongst those of us who study North Korea as the royal court economy. Now, in addition to the malfunctioning of the royal court economy, there is the increased tension with China. Whereas in the past, China served as the main ally and helper of the DPRK, things have dramatically changed since China is now ruled by the Crown Prince Party. Now, I explained in this video about China's education reform what the Crown Prince Party is, so I won't go into that. Essentially, from a Chinese point of view, the hardline regime in Pyongyang has kinda outlived its usefulness, and in order for it to become useful again, it should start emulating the Chinese economic reforms and become a useful market for Chinese goods. Actually, to become a much more useful market, because DPRK is already flooded with Chinese products. And here comes another problem for the regime. Some of those products that have flooded the North Korean market, whether Kim Jong-un likes it or not, are radios capable of catching the dissident radio stations from South Korea operated by defectors. Other products are smartphones with which uncensored internet can be accessed from several points in the country, and some other products are laptops. You get the picture. In addition to that, there's multiple networks of Japanese and dissident Koreans that make a living off the information trade. The information trade is essentially like this. Outsiders smuggle in USB sticks and DVDs with westernized material such as South Korean soap operas, news broadcasts, music, concerts, everything that may not be per se political propaganda, but which conveys the message about how things are outside of the gigantic safe space. In return, the dissident North Koreans within the country get this material for free and get to sell it and keep 100% of the profit. And in return for this favor, they occasionally smuggle out video footage with day-to-day life in North Korean society, so we, the passionate students, can also have a better understanding about the topic. Now, I have seen some of that footage. In fact, I have seen quite a lot of it. Around 1,000 hours in the last 3 years, to be more precise. And if time will allow, I will look for the footage that has already been given to some of the press and make a video of my own about day-to-day life in North Korea. But I can't promise anything because the place where I get to learn these things actively discourages republication because it could lead to the identification of dissenters, which is something that no sane person wants. Anyway, based on the numerous hours of footage that I have seen, I'm more than confident to say that on the grassroots, things are already changing very fast. Let me give you some examples. It used to be a capital offense. You would be shot in the head on the spot if you were caught selling anything. However, around January, February 2014, something suddenly changed, not in the law, but in the practice. Since then, illegal markets selling anything from DVDs to food and from perfumes to frying pans have become a common occurrence all over the country. Another example, private transport of people is forbidden. Yet as of late 2014, I have personally seen footage of at least several dozens of private transporters who quite literally harassed the police out from the premises when the police stopped them for doing illegal transportation of people. Recent dissidents also talk about reaching to the border with a private car, which strengthens the argument that private transport of people is so normalized that not even the hardline guards think it's something wrong when a car is very close to the northern border. More recently, footage has emerged with day-to-day talks amongst elite families with connections to the higher echelons of the party and with fancy apartments in the posh areas of Pyongyang, which will be the only areas that look somewhat civilized in that country, that is. And even there, the admiration for the regime is next to non-existent, even though those people would have the most to lose should the regime collapse. So, let's recap. There's shortage of hard currency to bribe the party into obedience and loyalism. There's widespread defiance of more and more laws across the land. There's widespread dissidence that is already too big to be solved through sending them all to Gulag. China no longer likes you in this fashion and wants you changed faster to suit the Chinese needs. And on top of that, there has been no significant military progress with which to brag and show your balls to the world and to the party. Because let's face it, the DPRK doesn't have nukes and it won't. The DPRK also doesn't have proper missiles. I mean, yes, they could strike Seoul, but they can't strike anywhere else outside the ocean where they could scare the fish, or towards China, which is not recommended for obvious reasons. In other words, Kim Jong-un is almost without escape. If he liberalizes the country even a bit more, the regime collapses. If he doubles down on the hardline measures, the regime still collapses, but 10 years from now instead of 5 to 7 years from now, because fewer and fewer people even care what he thinks. But if he manages to get the US to negotiate directly with Kim Jong-un, that is good enough for him to get the trust and the support within the party and within the country at large. Not enough to save his regime long term, mind you, but more than enough to buy him time to reorganize the royal court economy and thus kick the can down the road potentially for another 25 years from now. Notice that I didn't mention the topic. And that's because it doesn't matter, just like it didn't matter when Kim II brought the Bill Clinton administration to the negotiation table. Most of the topics there were irrelevant, but the fact that Kim could frame this as "we brought the imperialists to negotiate with us," that was good enough. Now, the situation in the 90s was far worse than now, for the DPRK and the US had fewer incentives to negotiate. In present day, however, there is more incentives for the US to negotiate, especially if there will be another Democrat administration from 2017. One of their citizens is held captive under largely bollocks reasons, and that's incentive enough. Or it should be, or maybe I should say it could be, since I don't believe it should. So, knowing all of these, though I'm sure that when I'll edit this video, I'll notice that there's at least something that I missed. There are essentially 4 different scenarios under which this can go about. One is do nothing, let Warmbier rot in the Gulag. Second, negotiate stealthily through China, essentially get China to add pressure on Pyongyang to stop being idiotic. It worked in the past, it could work now too. 3. Organize an extraction operation. Although this is extremely unlikely to happen, it is an option. You'd be surprised how easy it is to do that. And finally, 4. Submit to Kim's will and go and negotiate directly with him. This could prove to be the least damaging path for Otto Warmbier himself, but also the most damaging path long term for the relationships between the DPRK and the saner world. Now, this is a tough one, to be fair. On one hand, the US emphatically warns its citizens against ever visiting the DPRK, and that ignoring that warning is on the individual's own risk. But on the other hand, this is a 22-year-old who could not know better. I mean, who was supposed to warn him and teach him better? His far-left university teachers? His very likely liberal suburban parents? The 22-year-olds of 1980 understood and took it to their hearts that communism is evil, as the culture depicted the totalitarian nightmare far more accurate than it does today. In fact, ideation of socialist totalitarianism is rather the norm today, which is dangerous and a problem in and of itself, but not the fault of this particular 22-year-old. Some commentators have suggested an approach through the United Nations which is essentially a non-approach. The UN is a highly bloated and completely inefficient and largely irrelevant bureaucracy. That's what it is. The UN cannot essentially do anything, but even if it could, it still would not do anything, as the Council for Human Rights is chaired by Saudi Arabia, which is a North Korea but with Allah, slightly freer borders, and golden castles. Expecting a Saudi-led Human Rights Council to push for and enforce an international inspection on the human rights of prisoners is like expecting common sense from Jeremy Corbyn. It's just not going to happen. So, given what is at stake and with the risk of sounding very insensitive, the most sensible thing to do is to engage in a long-shot move with China. The commies in Beijing won't be too keen on jumping to pressure Pyongyang for an American citizens, at least not at first, but in 5 years, well, a lot of things can change in the US-China relations in order to make it in China's best interests to pressure the DPRK's regime to become slightly less insane. Now, it could very well be the case that Otto Warmbier will not survive 5 years in the Gulag, though that is not necessarily a given. We also know that the Pyongyang regime tries really hard to cover the existence of the gulags, and if Kim wants to use Warmbier as a geopolitical pawn, that means he's not excluding the possibility of releasing him at some point in time before the sentence expires. And for that, he needs him to be alive and at least semi-healthy 5 years from now. Preferably healthy enough so no one can correlate whatever he'll say about his treatment in the camp with the rest of the evidence of the North Korean Gulag. Going straight to Kim to negotiate with him would be a mistake in my view, because it would serve him with enough political capital to make DPRK viable enough for another generation. The seeds of that have already been planted with this conviction and sentencing, because one of the aspects of such dictatorships is that the tolerated foreign tourists are allowed some minor nonsense that the average Joe could never even dream. You know, that's how things rolled in the USSR, that's how we rolled back here in the days of Kim Il-sung's best friend, and that's how they generally roll in DPRK too, as evidenced by the daring violations of the DPRK's moral conduct committed by Western tourists and caught on camera, which did not end in criminal prosecution. Or as evidenced by the fact that it is a capital offense for an average North Korean to own a hard currency, you know, it's like a 5-euro bill, whereas foreigners can own as much foreign currency as they please. By going after this kid, the regime will attempt to send a message that not only such violations are for everyone, but the regime means it, and to such an extent that they will torture an American citizen to make their point. The US should not provide further gains to this maniacal regime, even if that means Otto Warmbier may not get to see the outside of North Korea ever again. So, what do you guys think? Am I being a bit too harsh? I mean, is the life of an irresponsible student who acted recklessly more important than the overall goal of slowly allowing the regime to collapse on its own? Because make no mistake, the Kim dynasty will collapse. The only question is whether it will collapse by the end of the next decade or will collapse closer to its 100th anniversary. If the US backs down and gives the maniac the aid that he will require in order to release this student, that aid will be enough to keep the regime afloat at least by the late 2030s, if not mid-2040s. Is that a reasonable trade-off? Because let's face it, there are no solutions, only trade-offs. Please do tell me in the comment section. Maybe I'm wrong. As for a more detailed view about video about the life in North Korea, well, I will try, but it's a lot of work to sift through the footage and make sure I don't include material that should not be included. So again, no promises on that. And with that being said, thank you for watching and supporting this channel. I'll see you around on Freedom Alternative.